Hello, everyone. My name is Brendan Marr. That noise you're hearing is my ventilator. And welcome to Page Turners They Were Not, my Star Wars podcast. Today, I would like to talk about how Luke Skywalker's journey in The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi corresponds to the hero's journey, or monomyth, as presented by Joseph Campbell in his great work, A Hero with a Thousand Faces. Now, let me preface this. Who is Joseph Campbell? Joseph Campbell was a comparative mythologist. Joseph Campbell was influenced by a fellow named Carl Jung. Carl Jung, you may have heard of, the great psychologist. Jung believed that all human beings subconsciously share similar ideas, similar concepts, that all across the world, humans have very common ideas in their mind, certain imaginative figures that are universal to all human beings. Joseph Campbell took this a step further. And even though he was not the first one to do it, he studied myths from all across the world to examine what were the similarities between these myths that almost every great myth shares. Now, not every myth corresponds exactly to what Joseph Campbell described, but there are elements that seem to exist in many different stories. Whether it's the story of Harry Potter, whether it's Star Wars, whether it's Lord of the Rings, whether it's even the stories of Buddha and Jesus. Many of the great world myths share commonalities. In Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, he outlined the monomyth, which are the basic steps on what is called the hero's journey. Luke Skywalker's journey in the Star Wars Original Trilogy mirrors the journey, the hero's journey, or monomyth. Now, George Lucas read The Hero with a Thousand Faces later in the process of writing Star Wars, so the thoughts came about later and are more self-evident in The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. But there was a slight influence on the original film. Well, George Lucas did not read the book before he started writing his screenplay. So there is a bit of an exaggeration in terms of how much a role The Hero with a Thousand Faces played in the creation of Star Wars. But it is absolutely true that it did have a great influence on the overall Star Wars trilogy. Okay, now that we've gotten all that hubbub and fluff out of the way, let's delve into it. I was reading The Steps of the Hero's Journey when I did not realize that there was a whole section dedicated to what is called the return. of what happens after the hero achieves his goal. Now let's go into that really quick. And then we'll jump into the return, which I was very surprised personally to discover how much it reminded me of what we see in The Last Jedi. So let's go really quick back to Return of the Jedi. Luke has achieved the goal, the goal of the quest, what he set out to get. Now, this is often called the ultimate boon. This is what the hero was journeying to get. Now, what was Luke on his journey to get? Well, remember what he said in the original film? I want to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi like my father. Luke's ultimate goal was to become a Jedi Knight. And he did in that great scene when he says to the Emperor, "You failed, Your Highness. I am a Jedi like my father before me." And also remember at that moment he cast away his lightsaber. That moment, that very moment when he threw away the lightsaber and said, "I am a Jedi like my father before me," is the moment where Luke's story is complete. He has achieved his goal. Now, he has achieved the goal of becoming a Jedi. Now, of course, as we know, he, helped his father fulfill his destiny. Now, what happened afterwards? Well, we know that Luke founded a Jedi training academy. One student, his nephew, Ben Solo, turned to the dark side, became Kylo Ren, and destroyed Luke's Jedi temple. And killed, or at least with his dark side buddies, killed the other students. So that doesn't exactly correspond to the hero's journey, but whatever. Now, what happens then? Luke puts himself into exile. A self-imposed exile. This is a step that is called refusal of the return. It says that the hero may not want to return to the ordinary world. Well, Luke certainly did that. He went and hid. In fact, what it says here is that the hero, having found what he wanted to get, may refuse to return and share that gift with the world. What was the gift that Luke got? He became a Jedi. But he refused to share it. He wanted the Jedi to end, rather. So he refused to share it with Rey. Now, there's a step called the magic flight. The next step in the journey, which says sometimes the hero must escape with the boon. What is the boon? The fact that he's a Jedi. Well, Luke certainly took a magic flight to Octo and hid there. He escaped. In fact, he used parts of his X-Wing to build his hut. So he took a flight and escaped. Now, the next step is called rescue from without. So here's what it says. Just as the hero may need guides and assistance to set out on the quest, often he must have powerful guides and rescuers to bring him back to everyday life, especially if the person has been wounded or weakened by the experience. Wow. Okay. That's a lot. Let's unpack that. So Luke went on his journey. I mean, Yoda and Obi-Wan and others to guide him on his quest. Well, what does it say here? It says the hero might need a guide and a rescuer to bring him back. Gee, who could that be? Rey. Rey brings him back. Now, obviously, physically, no. But it is Rey who was able to convince Luke, with another help from another rescuer, a diminutive little muppet named Yoda, in spirit form. Rey and Yoda together, and also with R2-D2. Let's not forget R2-D2. Through showing that hologram projection of Leia. These three rescuers are able to help Luke get back on the right path and desire to return and join the fight again. And also it says if the person has been wounded or weakened by the experience. Well, Luke was physically wounded on his hero's journey to achieve the goal, getting his hand cut off, of course. But also he was wounded and weakened by Kylo Ren turning against him and destroying the temple. Luke was wounded emotionally and arguably physically, but definitely emotionally and psychologically. Wounded by the experience, and he needed those guides, Rey, R2-D2, Yoda, to help him heal. And then we come to a next step called the crossing of the return threshold. The trick in returning is to retain the wisdom gained on the quest, to integrate that wisdom into a human life, and then maybe figure out how to share the wisdom with the rest of the world. Wow. Okay. Well, it says, the trick is to retain the wisdom gained on the quest. Remember, Yoda chided Luke severely, or it's still in his playful way, by basically saying, you didn't use the wisdom you learned. You went on this quest, you learned stuff, why aren't you using what you learned? Yoda was there to remind him that failure is a great teacher. This is something that Luke already knows. And yet it would seem Luke chose not to do anything with it. Luke chose not to learn from his mistakes, but to stew in his mistakes. To sit around and say, I messed up, instead of saying, I messed up, but I'm going to teach Rey what I learned from my mistake. Luke is too focused on his mistake. Yoda burning the tree was not about the tree. And it was not about the Jedi texts, by the way. Rey saved the text. It's a minor detail, but the text did not get burned in the tree. The burning of the tree was not about the text. It was about Luke learning to let go. These are lessons that Luke learned on his journey, on his original journey in the original films. But he seemed to have trouble integrating it into his current life. So, going with this step, Luke then learns from Yoda to integrate that wisdom into his life. And also, Yoda tells him, you should have passed on what you learned. You should have told Rey, here's what I learned from my mistake. Which correlates to what it says right here about the hero needs to learn how to share his wisdom with the rest of the world. So that corresponds quite closely there, I think. And then we come to a step called Master of Two Worlds. What does this mean? Let's take a look. This step is usually represented by a transcendental hero like Jesus or Gautama Buddha. For a human hero, it may mean achieving a balance between the material and the spiritual. The person has become comfortable and competent in both the inner and outer worlds. This is like Jesus having completed his mission. And remember when he was resurrected, he was with the people for 40 days. For 40 days teaching, and then ascended into heaven. After his resurrection, Jesus was indeed the master of two worlds. He was physical and spiritual together in one. Now for Luke, the master of two worlds is quite literal, you could say, in that he projects his form from one world to another. So he's quite literally the master of two worlds, as he is on Crate and Octo. Yes, he's not physically on Crate, but he certainly can interact with that world. He can do stuff on that world, even though it's just his disembodied form. So quite literally, Luke is the master of two worlds. But what else? Remember, Luke dies. This use of strength to save his friends ends up being the death of Luke because it's so strenuous. We assume he's dead. I think he's dead. I don't think he's coming back in Rise of Skywalker. But with a title like The Rise of Skywalker, the sky's the limit. That being said, Luke passes away. But because Luke has achieved a level of understanding in the Force, Luke becomes one with the Force upon his death. Further canon material explains how this is accomplished. But this is something that only very few Jedi have ever learned. And Luke has learned it. But the reason I think this applies to being the master of two worlds is that Luke, as a Force ghost, will now have the ability to exist both in the Force itself and physically make himself manifest and interact with his world, as we have seen Force ghosts like Yoda and Obi-Wan do. They interact with their world. So Luke is now the master of two worlds. Master of the physical world and master of the world beyond, of the Force itself. And this brings us to our final step, freedom to live. Luke finds the freedom to live. And here's what it says. Mastery leads to freedom from the fear of death, which in turn is the freedom to live. This is sometimes referred to as living in the moment, neither anticipating the future nor regretting the past. What let's break that down a bit. Now, the fear of death, Luke never really shows that he's afraid of death, so I don't think he learns to overcome his fear of death or his fear of death. I mean, certainly the Jedi have always taught that one should not fear death. Now, Luke, as we know, came to the island to die, in his own words. But he'd been there for a while. So it kind of makes you wonder, why didn't he die? Maybe he was afraid to. Maybe we can apply this to that step. Maybe Luke was afraid to finally do it. To die. And maybe that's what was holding him back. So, I don't know about that one. But this last sentence, living in the moment, neither anticipating the future nor regretting the past. Well, it's a very Jedi philosophy, particularly a Qui-Gon kind of philosophy. You know, keep your focus here and now where it belongs. But Luke was there on the island anticipating the future, anticipating his death, but also regretting the past. But what Luke learned, because of the journey of his character in The Last Jedi, is to put aside his fear of the future, to put aside the anticipation of the future, the anticipation of death, and also to put aside his regrets of the past. Both these things Luke accomplishes in The Last Jedi, thereby giving him the freedom to live. This is like, as Joseph Campbell put it, quoting the Bible, before Abraham was, I am. That's what God says to Abraham in the Bible. It's a sense of existing in the moment. Luke learns to put aside his fear of the future and fear of the past and become one with the moment. And that brings us to the end of the hero's journey. I believe, whether or not it was Rian Johnson's intention or not, that Luke's journey in The Last Jedi corresponds almost exactly to this final phase of the monomyth or hero's journey. So I believe that not only is it consistent with is Luke's journey in The Last Jedi consistent with fairy tales and myths, but I believe it is consistent with his character. And that's a discussion for another time. But to conclude, I believe that the journey on which Luke has gone, particularly in The Last Jedi, now the story's not complete, so we shall see. But focusing on Luke's journey in The Last Jedi corresponds to the mythological tropes that we as a human species have within all of us. So I believe that the new Star Wars trilogy does indeed continue the tradition, continue the themes, and continue the legacy of Star Wars. It is not, I repeat, not just some kind of cynical cash grab. I believe that there is depth. I believe that there is more mythology to be explored. And I believe particularly with what I've talked about today, that the new trilogy indeed continues the myth and the legend of Luke Skywalker in a way that adds more meaning and completes the hero's journey for the hero who began it long ago. My name is Brendan Murray. Thank you so much for tuning in. Let me know what you think. And thank you so much for listening to Page Turners They Were Not, my Star Wars podcast. May the Force be with you.